Sub-Commander Verath extended the invitation on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday aboard the Auvrek Patience, which kept a 26-hour rotation cycle that had been playing merry hell with my sleep schedule since week 1. He found me in the medical bay running inventory on the analgesic stock, which was either a coincidence or a sign that the universe had a sense of humor about how the next several hours were going to go. "Corporal Solis," he said, standing in the hatchway with the particular stillness that high-ranking Tharvan officers used instead of knocking. "The conditioning hour begins in 30 minutes. You are welcome to observe." I filed the last canister, noted the count on my tablet, and looked up. Verath was tall even for a Tharvan, easily 2.3 meters, with the broad, layered musculature they all carried, like someone had stacked river stones under skin the color of pale slate. His secondary eyes, the small amber ones set at his temples, were half open the way they got when he was paying closer attention than he wanted you to think. "I appreciate that," I said. "I'll be there." He gave the shallow nod that meant the conversation was complete, and left without any further comment. I finished the inventory, changed into my exercise kit, and walked the 3 corridors to the conditioning deck. I want to be precise about what the Tharvan conditioning deck was because it matters to the story. It was large, not gym large, hangar large. The Auvrek Patience was a long-range survey vessel, crew of around 240, and the Tharvan cultural relationship with physical conditioning was what a military historian might diplomatically describe as thorough. The space occupied 2 full decks amidships, with a vaulted overhead and panels that produced a light approximating their homeworld's midday sun, which ran hotter and brighter than anything I was comfortable working out under. The floor was a composite that had some give to it, more than standard deck plating, less than a proper mat. Along the walls hung equipment I recognized in broad principle if not specific function: resistance apparatus, weighted cables, platforms for jumping work, things shaped roughly like punching bags but filled with what I later learned was a dense fibrous compound about twice the resistance of anything we used. There were 40 or 50 Tharvan already present when I arrived. They worked in clusters, moving through routines that were impressive by any standard, the kind of output that came from a species whose homeworld gravity ran roughly 1.4 times standard, which meant they had been building musculature against that load for their entire evolutionary history. A Tharvan in baseline physical condition could, and would, pick up things that would put a human in the hospital for trying. I found a clear space near the observation rail that ran along the upper level, set my water bottle down, and started my own warm-up. Hip circles, shoulder rolls, the ankle mobility sequence my physiotherapist had drilled into me 3 years ago and that I had never once skipped since, because the one time I skipped it I had a grade 2 sprain inside the hour. I moved through it deliberately, taking my time, keeping my breathing even. I was aware of being watched. That had been true for most of my 12 weeks aboard the Auvrek Patience. I was the only human on the vessel. The exchange program was new enough that they were still working out the accommodation protocols, and the Tharvan relationship to novelty was to examine it carefully and at length until they had filed it into a category they understood. I had grown accustomed to the attention without particularly enjoying it. What I had noticed over those 12 weeks was that the watching had shifted in character. In the first few weeks, it had been the focused, neutral attention of a species trying to categorize something unfamiliar. By week 6 or 7, it had taken on a different quality, a quality I could only describe as comparative. They were watching me move and measuring what they saw against their own frame of reference, and the frame of reference they were using was themselves. This was understandable. I had no objection to it. I did what I always did when I was being studied, which was to go about my business at a steady pace and let the studying proceed. People tend to reach their own conclusions regardless of what you do or don't tell them. The question is only whether the conclusions are the ones they are ready to reach, or the ones that the evidence will eventually require. I finished the warm-up and moved into my conditioning sequence. I kept it light that day. I had a full 8-hour duty shift in the medical bay the next morning, and I did not want residual muscle fatigue affecting my manual dexterity. Bodyweight work mostly. Pull variations, push variations, some single leg stability work, a core sequence. Nothing that would leave me sore. I moved through it at the pace I always used, which was deliberate and controlled, with full range of motion and minimal wasted effort. Economy is the word I would use, not timidity. There is a difference, and it is a fairly significant one, but you need to be paying attention to the right things to see it. I was about 20 minutes into this when instructor Davil arrived. I knew who Davil was by reputation before I had any direct interaction with him. Aboard the Auvrek Patience, he held the rank of senior instructor, conditioning division, a role that had no precise equivalent in our own service structure, but which combined the functions of a physical training officer, a combat readiness assessor, and something closer to a priest in the particular religion of Tharvan physical culture. He was not the largest Tharvan on the ship. That distinction belonged to a cargo bay engineer named Gruvet, who stood nearly 2.5 meters, and whose arms were roughly the diameter of my torso. But Davil was, by any reasonable assessment, the most capable. He had competed at the Alliance-level conditioning trials twice. He had placed second the first time and first the second, and the second placement had been by a margin that the crew still talked about with the reverence that certain types of people reserve for sporting records. He came down the center of the deck the way significant people enter rooms they own, and the training clusters redistributed around him the way water moves around a stone. He stopped approximately 10 meters from where I was working, watched me for a moment, and then said something to the Tharvan nearest him. I did not catch it. I was focused on my current set. What I caught was the laughter. Not cruel exactly. The Tharvan version of amusement had a particular quality, a low, resonant sound produced somewhere in the chest that carried further than you expected. It rippled through the deck in the way that sounds ripple when a significant person makes a significant observation, and everyone nearby is paying attention to them. I finished my set. I took a breath. I picked up my water bottle, drank, and looked at Davil with what I hoped was mild curiosity. He looked back at me with the expression I had learned to read over 12 weeks, which was the expression of a species that had decided it, understood what it was looking at. "Your movement patterns are very careful," he said. His standard was precise. Most of the senior staff spoke it well, a point of professional pride. Careful in Tharvan usage carried a secondary meaning that their translators tended to elide. It meant something closer to appropriate to one's limitations. "Thank you," I said. "They are the movement patterns of someone managing injury or protecting against future injury." He tilted his head, a gesture that meant something like polite inquiry. "Do you have a chronic condition?" "Not currently." "Ah," he let the word sit there for a moment. "Then this is simply your capacity." I drank some more water. That's one way to put it. Around us, the training clusters had mostly stopped what they were doing. The Tharvan are a social species with a strong orientation toward hierarchy and public demonstration. They valued the instructive moment, the thing that happened in front of witnesses that established the correct order of things. I had been aboard long enough to recognize when one of those moments was being assembled. Subcommander Verath had positioned himself at the observation rail above, I noticed. He had not been there when I arrived. Davil walked toward me in a way that was entirely non-threatening. All the threat was implicit, the way it tends to be when someone who is very capable of being threatening decides not to bother because the situation doesn't require it. He stopped at what would have been conversational distance for two humans, which for a Tharvan was somewhat inside his personal space, which was another way of establishing the correct order of things without saying so. "I have been watching you train for several weeks," he said. "You are consistent, you are diligent, but I notice you never work to any significant load. You never push to a threshold that would produce meaningful adaptation." He paused. "Is that a human practice, deliberate avoidance of strain?" I considered the question. "I was keeping it light today," I said. "And yesterday?" "Also light." "And the day before?" I thought about the day before, which had been a day I spent largely on my feet running a full crew health assessment, and had come to the conditioning deck tired and with a mild headache. "Also fairly light," I said. Davil turned to address the room. He had a voice built for this, deep and carrying, and what he said translated roughly as, "The difficulty with assessing a new species is that you must be careful to distinguish between what a specimen is doing and what the specimen is capable of doing. Observation of the human over 12 weeks suggests those two things may be the same." He turned back to me with that polite inquiry head tilt. "No offense intended. It is a genuine difficulty." "None taken," I said, which was true. "It is a genuine difficulty." He smiled. The Tharvan expression for it was a slight widening of the primary eyes, not a mouth movement. "Would you be willing to demonstrate your actual capacity? For comparative purposes, it would be useful data." Around the deck, the assembled Tharvan had the look of people who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and were now watching it begin to happen. A few of the conditioning groups drifted closer. Someone near the equipment wall said something that got a low ripple of laughter. I put my water bottle down. "What did you have in mind?" I said. What Davil had in mind, it turned out, was structured. He was a professional, and professionals in his line of work did not simply point at someone and say, "Hit this." He ran it as a teaching session, which was, I came to understand, how he ran everything, because the teaching session format allowed him to make a public point while maintaining the form of courtesy. Over the next 40 minutes he demonstrated, in sequence, a series of physical benchmarks that he used to assess conditioning readiness in Tharvan recruits. He did not invite me to attempt each one. He demonstrated them, narrated their purpose, and then invited the assembled crew to consider what a given metric would produce if applied to a human frame. The first benchmark was a loaded carry, a resistance weight equivalent to 1.2 times body mass, carried for 200 meters at a sustained pace. Davil lifted the weight from a rack with one hand, described the load, and carried it the length of the deck and back without any particular change in his cadence or breathing. The crew watched him in the particular attentive silence they used for things they found impressive but expected to find impressive. "At equivalent body mass ratio," he said, returning the weight to its rack, "the load would need to be adjusted significantly for a human frame. The skeletal architecture does not support compressive loads at this ratio without risk of structural failure." He glanced at me. "This is not a criticism. Different architectures have different tolerances." "That's accurate," I said, which it was. Human spine mechanics under heavy load are a genuine area of physiological consideration, and there was nothing wrong with saying so. "The interesting question," he continued, "is what the actual human limit is, what load the frame can sustain before the risk becomes unacceptable." He looked at me with what was, I now recognized, the specific expression that preceded someone offering me an opportunity I had not asked for. "In your estimation?" "Depends on the individual," I said, "and their training history." "Yours?" I named a number. It was honest. It was the load at which my own training had plateaued, above which I was managing diminishing returns and elevated injury risk for my build and the specific demands of my posting. A medical technician's hands are a professional asset. I didn't load to failure on weeks. I had a full clinic schedule. The number I named was, in the context of a room full of Tharvan, not large. The polite way to describe the reaction was attentive. The less polite way was that two of the younger conditioning crew exchanged a look that I recognized across species lines without needing a cultural briefing. Dave moved on. The second benchmark was jump work, a standing vertical leap to a platform, height graded from standard to maximum, the Tharvan baseline representing a jump capacity that reflected their heavier homeworld musculature driving against lighter shipboard gravity. Dave demonstrated the top tier with what looked like minimal effort, the kind of jump that in shipboard gravity produced an arc that required a measured pause before gravity had enough time to bring him back down. The crew below the platform watched with the attentive appreciation of people watching something they considered baseline competence. He invited me to try the standard tier. I cleared it. The next tier I also cleared, though with notably less clearance than he had produced, which was a function of our respective geometries and was not surprising to anyone in the room. The tier above that I declined. Advisable, Dave said. He did not say it unkindly. He said it in the tone of a professional who had correctly predicted an outcome and was filing it. The third benchmark was grip endurance, a hanging test on a bar that was sized, I noticed, for Tharvan hands and was correspondingly wider than anything I trained on. I lasted 51 seconds before my grip gave out. The Tharvan standard, Dave noted for the room, was 2.3 minutes for a basic recruit. There was a sound from the crowd, low, resonant, not cruel, just descriptive. The third benchmark was grip endurance, which I have already described. The fourth was a recovery rate test, maximum effort sprint for 20 seconds, then measured assessment of how quickly the cardiovascular system returned to functional baseline. The Tharvan baseline was aggressive. Their systems recovered fast, a consequence of a circulatory architecture that operated at higher baseline pressure and had more efficient gas exchange than ours. My recovery rate was, by their metrics, slow. I knew this. I told Dave so when he asked, which saved him the time of measuring it and producing the number himself, and which he accepted with the professional acknowledgement of someone who had expected to arrive at that number and had arrived at it. The fifth benchmark was a reaction testing apparatus built into the wall, a panel of light points that activated in random sequence, and the task was to strike the activated point before the next one appeared. The apparatus was calibrated for Tharvan reaction times, which were somewhat faster than mine at the upper end. I hit 81% of the points. The Tharvan standard for basic recruits was 94%. Dave noted this for the room without commentary, which was its own kind of commentary. The sixth was mobility under load, a weighted carry performed through a series of directional changes and level transitions, designed to test whether load affected movement quality. Dave ran this one himself first, carrying twice the weight I would be asked to carry through the course with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom the exercise had long since stopped being difficult. I ran it at the assigned weight, completed the course, and noted two places where the course design assumed a stride length and turning radius that fit Tharvan geometry more naturally than mine. I mentioned this afterward, because it was accurate and relevant to anyone using the course for cross-species assessment, and Dave made a note of it with the expression of someone who had not previously considered the point and was now filing it. He ran through all 6 benchmarks over the full 40 minutes with scrupulous fairness. He acknowledged where human and Tharvan skeletal geometries produced genuinely different optimal configurations. He noted where my numbers were reasonable within a human context. He made no statements that were technically inaccurate. What he was doing, with enormous professional precision, was establishing a picture. The picture was, human conditioning, as exemplified by the specimen present, represented a category of physical capacity that fell well below the Tharvan baseline on every measurable axis. He did not say this. He did not need to. The assembled crew could see the numbers, and numbers have a clarity that words sometimes lack. By the end of the 6th benchmark, the watching crowd had grown. There were perhaps 80 Tharvan on the deck now, some of them off-rotation crew who had wandered in, some of them officers from adjacent departments who had no particular reason to be there, except that word had spread about what was happening. Subcommander Verath was still at the observation rail. He had been joined by two others I recognized as department heads. I was standing in the middle of all of this, being mildly interested in the benchmarks, because they were genuinely interesting, and drinking water at regular intervals, and noting which crew members had observable gait or posture compensations that warranted a follow-up. There were 4 of them. I had a good memory for that kind of thing. Davil let the room sit with the picture he had assembled for a moment. Then he said, "There is one more assessment I use, for recruits who have completed the standard conditioning program and are ready to evaluate their readiness for active service. It is a contact assessment." He said this with the same level tone he had used for everything else, as if contact assessment was simply the logical next item on the list. "A sparring bout," I said. "A structured demonstration. The recruit demonstrates their response to physical pressure, not their capacity to generate it, which the previous benchmarks have addressed, but their response to receiving it, their ability to maintain function under impact load." He paused. "It is the most informative single assessment in the battery. A recruit may perform adequately on all other metrics and fail entirely on this one. Conversely." There was a beat of quiet on the deck, the kind of quiet that has weight. "You're asking if I'll spar with you," I said. "I am asking if you are willing to participate in a structured demonstration. For comparative purposes, no outcome is required. Simply an honest assessment of response to pressure." I looked at him, he looked back at me. The room was very quiet. I had been in enough situations over my 12 weeks aboard the Auvrek Patience to understand what was happening. I was not being challenged in the way that required a dramatic response. I was being offered a frame in which the outcome was, in Davil's professional assessment, already determined, and the value of the exercise was in making the determination visible and formal. He was not doing this out of hostility. He was doing it because he believed it was true, and he believed that establishing true things publicly was a service to the community of people who needed to understand what they were working with. He was, in the specific and literal sense, trying to be helpful. I finished my water, set the bottle down, rolled my left shoulder once, because the left one has a tendency to sit slightly forward when I've been standing still for an extended period. "All right," I said. They cleared a space in the center of the deck. The composite floor had a set of demarcation lines built in circular, about 8 meters in diameter, that I understood were the standard bout boundary. Davil removed his outer conditioning jacket and handed it to one of the junior instructors. Underneath, he was wearing the standard compression underjacket that all the conditioning staff wore, and without the outer layer, the full architecture of him was unambiguous. I had seen him train. I knew what was there. It was not a surprise. It was still, in the plain descriptive sense, impressive. He gave me the courtesy of asking if I wanted to remove anything. I shook my head. I was in my exercise kit, which was already about as minimal as I was going to get. "The assessment is simple," he said, "for the benefit of the assembled crew as much as for me. I will apply pressure. Graduated. You respond as your capacity allows. There is no requirement to generate offense. This assessment is purely defensive. The measure is how long function is maintained under progressive load." He looked at me. "Ready?" "Yes," I said. He started light. I want to give him full credit for that, because he did. He was not a bully, and he was not performing cruelty. He was running the assessment the way he ran it with recruits, which meant he started at a level appropriate to a beginning candidate and escalated from there. The first several exchanges were almost gentle by any military training standard. Controlled pushes to the shoulders and sternum, designed to test balance and base. Grip tests on the wrists and forearms that measured reaction and stabilization. directional pressure at the hip, designed to unsettle the center of gravity. I stabilized. I didn't grab back. That wasn't the assessment, but I stayed on my feet and kept my base. And when the pressure came, I moved with it in the way that you move with pressure when you understand how bodies distribute force. I'd had the same combatives training that every service member gets, plus 8 months of additional work during my second year, plus the particular informal education that comes from growing up the youngest of 4 in a family where physical engagement was a normal part of the household weather system. My brother Tamaz in particular had opinions about this. He was 9 years older than me and had the build of someone who had spent his 20s doing the kind of outdoor labor that produced a specific category of physical confidence. Our mother used to say that learning to absorb a hit from Tamaz was the best education any of us ever got. She was not wrong. He had never, in our entire childhood, managed to knock me off my feet, and not because he hadn't tried. He just couldn't figure out why it wasn't working, and I was old enough by the time I understood why that I had the sense to keep the explanation to myself. Davil noted my stabilization without comment and escalated. The second level was harder. Full contact pressure to the torso and shoulder girdle, at a force that would have knocked most human trainees off their feet on the first exchange. I took the first hit, which was to my left shoulder at an angle that was designed to rotate me and break my base, and I went with the rotation, not because I was being thrown, but because going with the rotation was the correct mechanical response to that angle of force. I came back to base, took the second, which was a chest press at close range with both palms, the kind of impact that tends to produce a reflexive backward step. I didn't step back. I absorbed it through my knees, let my spine do what it was designed to do, and stayed put. There was a sound from the watching crowd, not laughter, something different, quieter. Davil's expression had shifted very slightly. Not dramatically, he was a professional, and professionals don't let their face become a public announcement about what they're thinking. But the set of his secondary eyes changed. I had been aboard long enough to notice. He escalated again. The third level was what I would describe, for the sake of precision, as significant. This was the level at which, if you were a new recruit who had just cleared the standard conditioning battery and felt reasonably confident about your physical readiness, you discovered that confidence was worth revising. The force he was generating was controlled and technically precise, but the technical precision was in service of finding and exploiting the mechanical vulnerabilities in a body structure. The angles at which the shoulder joint loses its best leverage, the moments in a recovery cycle where the core is transitioning, and the spine has a brief window of reduced bracing. He had clearly spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly where and when to push. I took a hit to the jaw, controlled, no-knuckle, heel of the palm, an impact assessment, not a strike. My head moved. My neck absorbed it the way necks are supposed to absorb impacts when the musculature is engaged, which mine was. I came back to neutral. I took a body shot left side below the ribs. This one was less pleasant. Davil had significant mass behind it, and he put it in at an angle that found the liver with more accuracy than I would have preferred. I took a sharp breath, and my weight shifted right reflexively, which was the correct response to that kind of impact. I didn't go down. I took a sweep attempt to my right ankle, which would have worked on a taller, heavier opponent whose center of mass was further from the ground. I'm not tall. My center of mass is where it is. I felt the floor under my right foot, felt the contact, let my weight drop slightly and redirect. Not a technique exactly, more the physical intuition that comes from having played contact sports through adolescence, and done enough sparring and training to have developed the reflex of not falling over when people try to make you fall over. I didn't go down. The room had gone very quiet. Davil reset. He looked at me. He looked at the room. Then he went to the fourth level. The fourth level was where I found out, in a specific and personal way, the upper boundary of what significant meant in the Tharvin conditioning assessment battery. He came at me with a sequence of 3 impacts in rapid succession: shoulder, body, shoulder again, at force levels that were substantially above what I had taken so far. The first shoulder hit rotated me hard. The body shot was, in plain terms, the hardest single impact I had taken from another person outside of the one time in my 2nd year of service that I had been caught in the peripheral effect of an equipment explosion in a bay I should not have been standing in. I went sideways. Not off my feet, sideways, catching myself with a step that turned into a pivot, ending up at a 90-degree angle from where I had been standing with my knees bent and my weight low, and both hands up in the bracing position that the body goes to when it has decided, at a level below conscious decision, that what comes next needs to be received rather than escaped. The third hit, the second shoulder, found me in that position and hit a slightly different geometry than it would have if I'd stayed put. My shoulder took it. I have a higher than average capacity for what medical literature describes as impact to functional threshold ratio, which is a formal way of saying that my body is reasonably good at taking hits and continuing to operate. I'd known this about myself since my early teens. It ran in my family on my father's side. His sisters were the same way, their mother before them. It was the kind of thing you tended to figure out early and file away without making a production of it. My vision got a little bright at the edges. That happened sometimes. I stayed on my feet. The deck was completely silent. Davil was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. He was a composed professional, and his face had the discipline of someone who had spent decades learning to keep it that way. But the secondary eyes were fully open. Wide-open Tharvin secondary eyes are an involuntary response. You can train your primary expression. You cannot train the secondary eyes. He stood where he was for a moment. Then he reached for the 4th level again, and I understood, watching him set up for it, that this was not escalation anymore. He was applying what I recognized as a significant fraction of his actual capacity, not the teaching session graduated sequence. He was trying to determine where the floor was, and the floor had not appeared on schedule. The next hit was to the center of the chest, not a palm press this time, but a proper full extension drive with his body weight behind it, the kind of impact that the Tharvin conditioning trials apparently used as a pass-fail threshold for upper-tier candidates. My sternum registered it. My ribs registered it. I went back 2 steps, not 1, 2, and my back foot found the deck boundary line, and I stopped there with my weight forward and my hands up and my breathing somewhat faster than I would have preferred it to be. He looked at me across 2 meters of empty deck space. I looked back at him. I had not gone down. He said not to me, but to the room, in the tone of a man making a professional observation. The assessment has produced an unexpected data point. The crowd said nothing. 80 Tharvin warriors, conditioning staff, officers from 3 departments, the 2 department heads at the observation rail next to Sub-Commander Varath. Not one of them said anything. I straightened. My left side did not feel excellent. That was fine. My left side had felt worse and kept working. This was not new information about either of us. Davil looked at me. You have not attempted any offense. No, I said. Is that, he paused, which was unusual for him. Is that a capacity limitation or a choice? I thought about the most accurate way to answer the question. Choice, I said. You said the assessment was defensive. He absorbed this, and if the assessment were not limited to the defensive. I looked at him. He was 2.3 meters of the most capable physical specimen on a ship full of beings whose homeworld gravity had been building them against 1.4, standard for their entire evolutionary history. He had placed first at Alliance-level conditioning trials by a record margin. Then I'd approach it differently, I said. This was true. I did not elaborate on how. The elaboration was not necessary to make the point, and making the point quietly was the correct choice. The room seemed to understand this without my needing to explain it, which was good, because explanation would have diminished what the quiet was doing. Davil held my gaze for a long moment. Then he did something I had not seen him do in any of the 12 weeks I had been aboard, which was tilt his head forward, chin down, primary eyes lowered, brief and precise. It was the Tharvan gesture of acknowledgement that you gave to something that had recalibrated your understanding, and it was distinct from the polite inquiry tilt he used when he was gathering data. It was not a bow, exactly. It was closer to the movement a very careful scientist makes when they have been looking at a specimen one way for a long time, and the specimen has just suggested there might be another way to look. I picked up my water bottle from the edge of the boundary where I had set it before we started. I drank. I rolled my left shoulder again. It had been right to warn me about this, and I made a mental note to ice it when I got back to the medical bay. I should mention, I said, because it seemed relevant and I believed in relevant information, that in 12 weeks I have been keeping my conditioning sessions light. As I told you earlier, I'm on full clinic rotation this week, and I need my hands functional. The silence on the deck had a different quality now than it had at the start of the session. At the start, it had been the silence of a room that was waiting to watch something expected happen. The current silence was the silence of a room that had watched something happen that it needed time to file correctly. Davil said, "Light." "Light," I confirmed. He looked at me for a moment, then he looked at the assembled crew, then he looked back at me. "You understand," he said, "that what you just described has implications." "I imagine it does," I said. He turned again to the room, and when he spoke it was in that same carrying, professional tone he used for all his teaching observations. "When assessing an unfamiliar species," he said, "there is a category error that the competent instructor must guard against. This is the error of evaluating what a specimen produces in a given assessment and concluding that this reflects the specimen's absolute capacity." He paused. "Corporal Solis has spent 12 weeks aboard this vessel demonstrating approximately," he looked at me. "About 60%, I said, "give or take." He turned back to the room. "Approximately 60% of her actual conditioning output. The remainder she has been," he paused again. "Saving," I said. "Saving," he repeated. He said the word with the care you give a word that has just acquired meaning it did not previously have for you. Above us at the rail, Subcommander Vereth made a sound. It was brief and quiet, and had the quality of a person who has just revised a calculation they were reasonably confident in. The two department heads next to him said nothing, which was itself a form of commentary. One of the younger conditioning staff near the equipment wall, a third rank named Sevet, who had been the one exchanging looks during the loaded carry benchmark, said something in Tharvan that my standard translators caught as roughly she was holding back. The word he used for holding back was the Tharvan word that specifically meant a warrior maintaining reserve capacity for a later engagement. A word with significant tactical connotations that I was fairly sure he had not intended to apply here and could not now retract. Davil heard it. He looked at Sevet for a moment, not unkindly, but with precision, and then looked back at me. "I owe you an honest observation," he said. "Go ahead," I said. "When I invited you to participate today, I expected the session to produce one type of data. It has produced another type." He was choosing his words with the care of a professional who valued accuracy and was recalibrating in real time. The initial benchmarks suggested a set of conclusions about human physical parameters that I now understand were partial, I said. "Partial," he agreed. The further question he stopped, considered, started again. "The further question is whether the parameters I observed over 12 weeks were representative of human capacity at all, or whether they were representative of the specific choices one human was making in a specific professional context." The second one, I said. I see. I'm a medical technician, I said. My hands are a professional liability if I injure them. I do not train to failure during clinic weeks. I thought about how to put this, being careful not to make anyone uncomfortable. The deck was quiet for a beat. Uncomfortable, Davil repeated. You had a picture you were building, I said. I didn't think it was my place to complicate it before I understood why you were building it. This was honest. 12 weeks is not very long to understand a ship's culture, but it had been long enough to understand that the Tharvan had a very specific way of establishing the social architecture of a mixed crew environment, and that the architecture needed to be established correctly before it could be adjusted, and that the person who adjusted it too early and too loudly tended to produce a defensive reaction rather than a genuine recalibration. I had been waiting for the right moment. The right moment, I had learned, was not when you had something to prove. It was when the other party was already close enough to the truth that meeting them there produced understanding rather than argument. Davil looked at me for a long moment. You were observing us, he said. Of course, I said. Another beat, he said, and your assessment of what you observed. I considered this. You run an extremely well-structured program, I said. The escalation protocol in the assessment is very clean. The way you build the room as a teaching environment, the narration, the progression, that's sophisticated pedagogy. I've been taking notes. I paused. Also, Sevet needs to work on his left side bracing. He drops his shoulder when he's recovering from a body shot. I noticed it during the group drill in week 7 and it's still there. If he takes a right side impact while he's dropping that shoulder, someone's going to need to file a medical report. Sevet, from the equipment wall, stood very still. Davil looked at me. He looked at Sevet. He looked at the rest of the room. He looked back at me. You've been watching the conditioning drills for 12 weeks, he said. Hard not to, I said. The deck is 2 levels below the medical bay and I have the duty rotation report. I know everyone's conditioning schedule. Professional interest, injured crew generates medical work. I took another drink of water. Sevet's shoulder. Also, Subcommander Varath has been compensating for a grade 1 strain in his right hip flexor for at least 6 weeks. He's been adjusting his gait on the return leg of his standard drill circuit. He should probably come see me. At the observation rail above, Subcommander Varath made a different kind of sound. He does not like the medical bay, Davil said, in the tone of a man confirming information he already had. No one does, I said. That's why they wait until things get worse. I finished my water. The hip flexor is currently a grade 1. If he lets it go another 3 weeks at current activity levels, it becomes a grade 2, and then we're talking about 8 weeks of modified duty protocol. Tell him I said so. Davil looked up at Varath. Varath looked down at me. The quality of this look was complex in ways that would have taken longer than I had to fully analyze. It contained, as far as I could interpret it, something between formal acknowledgement and the specific expression of a very senior person, discovering that a very junior person has been paying more attention than anyone accounted for. I will tell him, Davil said. Thank you, I picked up my kit bag. I'm going to go ice my left side. I had made it approximately 4 steps toward the hatchway when Davil spoke again. Corporal Solis. I stopped, turned. He was standing where I had left him, in the center of the cleared bout space, with 80 Tharvan warriors at his back and the full conditioning deck around him. He had the demeanor of a person who had been thinking about what to say while I was walking away and had decided something. Next week, he said, when your clinic rotation has ended, would you be willing to work with me? He paused, not as a demonstration subject, as a colleague. I looked at him for a moment. What specifically? I said. You have spent 12 weeks observing our conditioning methods. I have spent 12 weeks observing yours. Or what I believe to be yours. He tilted his head, the polite inquiry angle, but with something different underneath it now, a quality of genuine rather than procedural interest. I suspect I have been studying an incomplete picture. You have, I said. Then I would like to study the complete one. I thought about this. My schedule had some flexibility the following week. I also genuinely found the Tharvan conditioning program interesting, and 12 weeks of watching it while running my own parallel track had given me some thoughts about the areas of intersection between their methods and ours. The places where their emphasis on power generation could learn something from our emphasis on economy of movement, and vice versa. The Tharvan program was oriented almost entirely toward output maximization. It produced extraordinary results for beings with their particular architecture. It had essentially no framework for the recovery optimization and load management that kept a body functional over the long term, which I suspected was related to the number of chronic joint issues I was seeing in the senior conditioning staff. I had notes on this, they were thorough. "All right," I said, "Tuesday after my shift." He gave the chin-down acknowledgement again. "Tuesday," he agreed. I left the deck and walked the 3 corridors back to the medical bay, where I retrieved an ice pack from the supply cabinet and applied it to my left side, which objected to this in the straightforward way that ribs do when someone has recently hit them at meaningful force. I wrote up the session in my duty log as a cross-cultural conditioning exchange, observational and participatory, no significant injuries, which was accurate. The rib situation would resolve in a few days and did not require formal medical documentation. I made a note to follow up on Verath's hip flexor at the end of the week. I made a second note to pull the full conditioning staff health records and cross-reference them against the drill rotation schedule, because the joint issue pattern I was seeing in the senior staff suggested something systemic in their program design that was worth understanding before it produced a medical event I'd have to write a longer report about. I also made a note, this one not in the duty log, just in the personal notation file I kept that was nobody's business but mine, that I had been approximately right about the timing. 12 weeks was about the right duration to let the Tharvan conditioning staff form and hold a picture, observe it long enough to become confident in it, and then encounter the data point that the picture was missing. Too early would have produced argument. 12 weeks had produced something closer to genuine revision, which was considerably more durable. The process had produced one result I hadn't fully anticipated, which was that Davel was, by any measure, an excellent technical mind and a more interesting person than I had room to appreciate while I was being studied. The follow-up session on Tuesday had the potential to be genuinely productive. The Tharvan recovery protocols were, as I had assessed, essentially absent from their program, and I had 8 months of load management theory that I had spent 2 years applying to my own training, and that I suspected would translate reasonably well to a higher baseline physiology. I finished icing my ribs. I updated the medical supply manifest, which I had started to update before Verath arrived with the invitation to the conditioning deck, and which represented what now felt like a previous era in the afternoon. I ate a meal that was technically dinner by the ship's rotation and went to my quarters, where I lay down and considered the ceiling for a while before sleeping. The next morning I had a full clinic rotation, and the morning after that, and the one after that. The medical bay was busy enough that I had no particular reason to think about the conditioning deck until day 4, when I was reviewing the crew health records and noticed that Subcommander Verath had scheduled a medical appointment for Friday afternoon. The appointment reason field said, hip flexor assessment. Referral from Instructor Davel. I marked it confirmed and moved on to the next file. On Friday afternoon, Verath came to the medical bay with the particular posture of a very senior officer doing something he had decided to do, without wanting it to be noticed that he'd decided to do it. He sat on the examination table with the careful arrangement of limbs that tall Tharvan used on furniture that was technically too small for them, and he submitted to the assessment with the specific silence of a person who has already reviewed their options and concluded that the current option is the least bad one. The hip flexor was a grade 1.5 by then, trending toward 2. I gave him the treatment protocol, the activity modification guidelines, and the prognosis, which was 8 weeks if he followed the protocol and rather longer if he didn't. He listened to all of this with his primary eyes focused on a point somewhere above my left shoulder, which I had learned was the Tharvan equivalent of maintaining professional composure while receiving information you would have preferred not to receive. When I was done, he said, "You noticed this 6 weeks ago." "Approximately," I said. "From the medical bay. From the duty rotation report and the gait adjustment on the drill circuit return leg." I corrected the pronoun. "On your drill circuit return leg." He absorbed this. "You did not say anything." "I didn't know you yet," I said. I try not to deliver unsolicited medical advice to people I've only known a few weeks. It tends to land badly. He was quiet for a moment. "And now you know me." "Better than I did," I said. "Also, you made an appointment. That helps." He looked at me then, properly, not at a point above my shoulder. The secondary eyes were half open, which was the attentive register rather than the surprised reflex register he had been running on Tuesday afternoon in the conditioning deck. It was a different quality of attention. "The crew has been discussing the conditioning session," he said. "I imagine so," I said. "There is a view," he said carefully, "that the exchange program has been running on a particular set of assumptions about the human participant's capacity, and that those assumptions may need revision." "That's a fair view," I said. "There is also a view," he continued, "that the human participant may have been allowing those assumptions to persist, and that this was a choice." "Also fair," I said. He was quiet again. The medical bay had the hum of its environmental systems and the distant sounds of the ship moving around us. After a moment he said, "Why?" It was a single word, and it was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He wanted to know. "Because assumptions correct themselves faster when they have time to become visible," I said. "If I'd walked onto this ship 12 weeks ago and tried to correct every assumption immediately, it would have looked like argument. People defend assumptions that are being argued with. But if you let them sit and watch and take their time and then encounter the data themselves," I shrugged. "The data lands differently. It's theirs then, not something you're telling them." Verath looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was harder to read than his usual professional composure, not the involuntary secondary eye response that meant surprise, but something more deliberate. He was reassessing, and he was doing it openly, which for a Tharvan officer of his rank took a specific kind of steadiness. "You are a medical technician," he said. "Third class," I said. "Yes." "The exchange program listed you as a medical technician." "It did." Not as he paused. The word he was looking for existed in Tharvan, but not directly in Standard. His translator offered strategic observer as the closest equivalent, which was not entirely wrong. Not as someone who makes extended assessments of crew dynamics and intervenes at the optimal moment. "A medical technician," I said, "who observes things. It is difficult to do the job without observing things." He held my gaze for another beat, then made the chin-down acknowledgement, slower than the one Davil had given me, and held longer. On a Tharvan officer of his rank, the prolonged version of that gesture had a specific weight. It was the acknowledgement you gave when you were not just registering new information, but revising the framework you used to interpret information. It meant something closer to "I have been looking at this incorrectly, and I am now looking at it correctly." "Your Tuesday appointment with Instructor Davil," he said. "I would like to attend." "It's a working session," I said, "not an observation." He understood the distinction. "I understand," he said. "But you're welcome," I said. He gave the chin down again, shorter this time. The short one had a different meaning, acknowledgement of something offered freely rather than acknowledgement of something that had required revision. They were not the same gesture, exactly, though they looked similar from a distance. I had learned to tell them apart somewhere around week 8. He came to the Tuesday session. So did Sevet, who had apparently done some independent work on his left side bracing in the intervening days and wanted someone to assess the correction. So did 3 other crew members I had provided informal observations on over 12 weeks, now that the informal observations had achieved a kind of official standing. The session ran 2 hours instead of the planned one. Davil and I worked through the load management framework I had developed over my 2nd year of service, and he worked through the power generation protocols that the Tharvan conditioning system emphasized. And somewhere in the 2nd hour, we found the place where those 2 things intersected in ways that were genuinely interesting to both of us. Sevet's bracing had improved. I told him so. He stood a little straighter, which was its own small data point about the particular kind of information a person was willing to receive and from whom. I went back to the medical bay afterward and updated my duty log. The session had gone in directions I had anticipated and a few I hadn't. The load management framework had landed as I expected. The Tharvan had no equivalent concept, and seeing it laid out in terms of training stimulus, adaptation window, and recovery debt produced the specific look that useful information produces in people who hadn't previously organized their practice around it. Davil had been quiet for a long time after the first explanation, and then he had asked 3 questions in sequence that were each more precise than the last, which was how I had learned that he thought. He moved through information the way he moved through a physical assessment, methodically, testing each point for structural integrity before adding the next layer. The unexpected direction was the biomechanics conversation. I had pulled up the gait analysis I had been building on senior conditioning staff from the rotation report data, not individual medical records, which were private, but movement observations I had logged as general medical notes over 12 weeks, and Davil had looked at my notation system for approximately 45 seconds before asking how I had been capturing it. When I explained, he asked to see the full dataset. When I showed him, he was quiet for longer than he had been after the load management explanation. What I had, essentially, was a 12-week longitudinal observation of how 40 senior conditioning practitioners moved when they were not performing for an audience. The adjustments they made when they thought no one was paying attention. The asymmetries that training had built in rather than corrected. The places where the Tharvan program's emphasis on output maximization had quietly created compensatory patterns that would produce joint issues at a predictable rate. Davil had looked at this for a while. Then he had said, very carefully, "How long were you going to observe before saying something?" "Until someone asked me a direct question," I said. He had looked at me for another moment. Then he had turned to Verath, who was standing at the edge of the session space with his arms folded, and said something in Tharvan that my translators rendered as the medical technician has been running a 12-week conditioning assessment of this crew, and we did not know about it. Verath had looked at me. I had said I prefer medical observation. The crew generates the data naturally. I just keep notes. The silence that followed this had a quality I was coming to associate with the Tharvan process of revising a substantial assumption. The particular stillness of a group of people who had believed they understood something, and were now discovering that what they understood was one layer of a thing that had several more layers, all of which had been present the entire time. Sevet had said, from where he was standing, she was observing us while we were observing her. Yes, I thought, that's about right. Davil had said, is this a human practice, running parallel assessments while appearing to be assessed? I had thought about this. Some humans, I said. It depends on the context and the individual. I paused. I grew up the youngest of 4. you develop habits. The entry I wrote was cross-cultural conditioning exchange collaborative. Participation expanded from original scope. Hip flexor follow-up conducted during session. No significant injuries. I thought about adding something more, then decided the plain account was sufficient. It usually is. The plain account, if you have been paying attention to what is actually there, tends to contain the significant things without requiring embellishment. My left side was doing better. I had 2 more weeks of clinic rotation, and then, for the first time since boarding the Auvrek Patience, I was going to train at the level that the word training was intended to mean. I looked forward to that with the mild, private interest I tend to bring to things I expect to go well. It is possible that some portion of that interest also contained anticipation of a specific type. The anticipation of watching a room full of very confident people quietly revise their frameworks for the second time. But I did not write that in the duty log. Some things you keep to yourself, not because they're secret, but because they're better experienced directly than described in advance. Tuesday would arrive. It always did.